Hello, beautiful soul. I'm Aurora, and welcome to Twin Flame Journey, a space where we explore the deeper meaning behind soul connections, divine timing, and the path that leads two hearts back to union. If you've been feeling the signs, you're in the right place.
Why does he finally wake up? Only after her love stops reaching for him? Not because she became harder to get. Not because he suddenly realized she was the one. Sometimes it's something much more uncomfortable than that. Sometimes he doesn't understand the value of her love while it's still moving toward him, because part of him has quietly learned to survive by assuming she'll always be there. And then one day, she stops sending the message, stops checking in, stops trying to fix the silence. She doesn't become colder. She simply gets tired. That's the moment something strange begins inside him. Not immediately. At first he tells himself he's relieved. Then he gets busy. Then he distracts himself. Then one ordinary Tuesday, while reaching for his phone without thinking, he realizes the notification he unconsciously expected isn't coming anymore. And somehow, that silence says more than every conversation they ever had. He kept saying he needed space. Not dramatically. Not during some huge fight where people throw words they can't take back. It was quieter than that. I've just got a lot going on. I need to focus on work. My head's a mess lately. I don't want to drag you into it. None of those sentences were completely false. That's the uncomfortable part. He really was overwhelmed. He really did feel tired. He really did need moments where nobody expected anything from him. But if I'm honest, space was often just a word that sounded kinder than saying, I'm scared of how much this relationship is starting to matter. Most men will never say that sentence out loud. Some don't even know that's what they're feeling. They'll call it pressure, loss of freedom, stress, bad timing, anything but fear. Because fear sounds weak. And he wasn't trying to be weak. He was trying to look like someone who still had control over his own life. So when she finally stopped texting first, when she stopped asking if he got home safely, when she stopped sending him random photos of a cloud that reminded her of something stupid they'd laughed about, he thought, finally, a little breathing room. At least that's what he told himself. The first couple of days almost felt lighter. No phone buzzing while he was working. No emotional conversations waiting for him at night. No guilt when he forgot to answer for 3 hours. He didn't have to think about whether he'd sounded distant. Didn't have to reassure anyone. Didn't have to explain why he was tired. It almost felt peaceful. Almost. There's a strange kind of relief that comes right after emotional responsibility disappears. People don't like admitting that. But it's real. Sometimes when someone stops needing you, or stops expecting you, your nervous system relaxes before your heart has time to notice what's been lost. So he slept better that first night. He laughed more with his friends. Stayed late at work. Watched 3 episodes of some show he'd already seen before because it required absolutely no emotional energy. He thought, maybe this is what I needed. Maybe we were becoming too intense. Maybe I've been right all along. But relief has a very short half-life when it isn't actually solving the real problem. A few days later, little things started happening. Not big dramatic realizations. Tiny ones. He reached for his phone while standing in line for coffee. Not because he wanted to text her. Just out of habit. His thumb unlocked the screen before he'd even realized what he was doing. Nothing. He stared at the notifications for maybe 2 seconds longer than necessary. Then locked the phone again. Weird. He told himself. And ordered his coffee. That should have been the end of it. Except, the next day he did it again. Then again while sitting at a red light. Again before bed. Again walking out of the grocery store. His body kept expecting something his mind insisted it didn't care about. That's the thing nobody prepares you for. Habits built by love don't disappear the same day love stops reaching. Sometimes the body keeps living inside yesterday's relationship. He'd be driving home after work, the radio playing quietly, traffic moving slowly, and for one split second, he'd think, I should tell her about what happened today. Some ridiculous thing his coworker said. The customer who accidentally called him by the wrong name 3 times. The dog that followed him across the parking lot. Nothing important. The kind of stories that aren't really stories. The ones you only tell one person because they're woven into your ordinary day. Then he'd remember. Oh, right. We're not doing that anymore. And the silence inside the car somehow became louder than the music. He never expected to miss the boring conversations. Those were the first ones to disappear. Not the romance. The routine. One night he opened the refrigerator. Stood there for almost a full minute. Not because he was hungry. He couldn't even decide what he wanted. He just stood there. Cold air spilling onto the kitchen floor. Eventually he laughed to himself. What am I doing? Nobody answered. The apartment suddenly sounded different. Funny how silence changes shape depending on who's missing. He wasn't heartbroken. Not yet. That's important. People imagine these moments like movies. One dramatic realization. One devastating breakdown. One instant where everything becomes clear. Real life rarely works that way. It's slower. Messier. Embarrassingly ordinary. Sometimes heartbreak begins with standing in front of an open refrigerator. Or noticing there's nobody to send a picture of the terrible dinner you just made. Or hearing something funny. Laughing. Then realizing you don't instinctively know who to send it to anymore. Loss doesn't always arrive screaming. Sometimes it slips into the room wearing your daily routine. He kept telling people he was fine. Because, honestly, he mostly believed it. His friends asked, So, you guys still talking? Nah. You okay? Yeah. You sure? I'm actually good. And maybe 70% of him meant it. The other 30% stayed strangely quiet. That quiet part never argued. Never interrupted. It just kept watching. Like another version of himself sitting across the room. Waiting. Sometimes late at night. That quieter voice would ask, Are you really happier? He'd answer almost immediately. Yes. The silence lingered. Really? I said yes. Then he'd pick up his phone. Open Instagram. Scroll for 10 minutes without remembering a single thing he'd seen. Anything to stop that conversation from continuing. Avoidance isn't always loud. Sometimes avoidance looks incredibly normal. Answering emails at 11 at night. Organizing the garage. Going to the gym twice in one day. Watching YouTube until 2 in the morning. Deep cleaning the bathroom because somehow the grout suddenly matters. It all looks productive. Healthy even. But sometimes, you're not cleaning the kitchen. You're trying not to hear yourself think. I remember doing that once. Scrubbing a countertop that was already clean. Not because it needed cleaning. Because if my hands stopped moving, my thoughts would catch up. He kept saying he wanted space. Maybe he did. But space feels completely different when you realize nobody is waiting on the other side of it anymore. There's a difference between leaving a conversation and discovering the conversation has ended without you. That realization doesn't hit immediately. It arrives in fragments. One missing notification. One empty evening. One instinct to reach out. Interrupted halfway through. He typed her name once. Not to send anything. Just typed it into the search bar. Her profile appeared instantly. Of course it did. He hadn't forgotten it. He looked at her picture for maybe 15 seconds. Didn't click. Didn't like anything. Didn't message. Closed the app. Opened it again 30 minutes later. Looked again. Then closed it. It felt ridiculous. What are you doing? He muttered to himself. I don't know. That was the honest answer. Part of him still believed she would text eventually. Maybe she was giving him space. Maybe she was busy. Maybe tomorrow. The mind is incredibly creative when protecting itself from finality. Because as long as tomorrow exists, nothing has really ended. But tomorrow kept becoming another tomorrow. And another. And another. Until one evening he caught himself listening for a notification that never came. Not consciously. His shoulders actually shifted every time someone else's phone buzzed nearby. His body kept preparing for something that reality had already abandoned. He'd asked for space. Didn't he? Did you really? The quieter voice returned. Partially. What about the rest? He looked out the window. Cars passing below. People walking home. Lights flickering on in apartment windows across the street. Finally he whispered something he'd never have admitted a week earlier. I thought she'd still be reaching. Not forever. Just long enough for him to figure himself out. Long enough for him to come back when he was ready. He never considered that she might become tired before he became ready. That's the part that changes everything. Because there is a version of love that keeps waiting. And there is another version that simply runs out of strength. Not because it stops loving. Because it can no longer survive reaching towards someone who keeps stepping backward. He didn't understand that yet. Not fully. Right now all he knew was something small had begun to unravel inside him. Nothing dramatic. Nothing anyone else could see. Just a strange, quiet realization. The space he thought he wanted had slowly become a place where her absence was finally loud enough to hear. The strange thing about consistent love is that it slowly disappears from your awareness. Not because it becomes less valuable. Because the human brain gets used to almost everything. You stop hearing the refrigerator humming. You stop noticing the clock ticking. You stop feeling your watch on your wrist. And sometimes, you stop noticing the person who's quietly holding pieces of your emotional life together. Not intentionally. Just. Gradually. He never woke up thinking, I'm going to take her for granted today. Nobody really does. That's why these stories are so painful. The damage rarely comes from cruelty. More often, it comes from familiarity. She became part of the landscape of his life. Like morning coffee. Like knowing where his keys usually were. Like expecting the hallway light to turn on when he flipped the switch. Reliable things become invisible. She would text him. Drive safe. He'd glance at it. Smile maybe. Type. Will do. Sometimes just a thumbs up. He never stopped to think why that message was there every single day. Not because he didn't appreciate it. Because appreciation doesn't naturally stay at the front of your mind when something has never disappeared. You notice oxygen when someone takes it away. Not while you're breathing. I remember someone asking me once, what did you love most about her? I answered with all the obvious things. Her laugh. Her intelligence. The way she looked at me when I was talking about something I cared about. Years later. Those weren't the things that hurt the most to lose. It was much smaller than that. She always remembered that I hated tomatoes on sandwiches. I never had to remind her. She noticed when I was getting overwhelmed before I noticed it myself. She could tell from the way I closed the front door whether work had been awful. She'd quietly hand me a glass of water before asking any questions. Back then, those moments barely registered. Afterward, they became impossible to forget. Funny how memory works. It enlarges what routine once hid. She wasn't performing love. She was living it. There's a difference. Performative love announces itself. Look what I did for you. Look how much I sacrifice. Notice me. Quiet love doesn't interrupt your day. It simply makes your day easier. And because it doesn't demand applause, it's often mistaken for something ordinary. He didn't think. She's carrying so much emotional weight. He thought. This is just how our relationship works. Until one day, it didn't. Maybe she was always the one asking, "Did you eat?" Not because she thought he couldn't feed himself. Because caring had become automatic. Maybe she remembered his mother's birthday when he almost forgot. Maybe she reminded him to bring a jacket because she'd checked the weather. Maybe she knew exactly when to leave him alone after a difficult meeting. None of those things felt extraordinary. They became background noise. Until silence replaced them. Background noise has an odd way of becoming deafening after it disappears. He didn't realize how many tiny decisions she made every day that quietly protected the relationship. Not grand gestures. Tiny corrections. When he replied with one-word answers. She kept the conversation going. When he forgot to ask how her day went. She didn't make him feel guilty. When there was awkward silence. She filled it. When they misunderstood each other. She usually reached first. Not because she enjoyed carrying everything. Because someone had to keep emotional movement alive. He didn't see it then. He thought conversations simply happened. Relationships simply flowed. Love simply stayed. He didn't realize someone was constantly choosing those things. Over. And over. And over again. There's something embarrassing about admitting this. Especially as a man. Because we like believing we're emotionally independent. We tell ourselves, "I'm low maintenance. I don't need much. I'm easy." Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's just another way of saying, "I've gotten used to someone quietly doing emotional work I no longer recognize." Those are different things. One afternoon he found himself sitting in traffic. Nothing unusual. The light turned red. He waited. His phone buzzed. For a split second. His chest lifted. Then he looked. Bank notification. He actually felt disappointed. It lasted maybe 1 second. Then he laughed at himself. What did you expect? Nothing. He expected nothing. Didn't he? The body answered before the mind could invent another story. He started noticing little inconveniences. Not because life became harder. Because nobody was smoothing the edges anymore. He forgot an appointment. Nobody reminded him. He had a terrible week at work. Nobody texted. "You've got this." He got sick for 2 days. Not seriously. Just enough to spend an afternoon lying on the couch. He reached for his phone more times than he'd admit. Nobody asked, "How are you feeling today?" It's funny. People think missing someone means constantly crying. Sometimes missing someone looks like staring at your phone while you have a fever. Realizing nobody knows you're sick. Did she really do that much? The quieter voice asked one evening. He frowned. I don't know. Think. So he did. And memories began arriving out of order. Not cinematic flashbacks. Fragments. She always noticed when he went quiet at parties. She'd gently pull him into another conversation before people realized he felt awkward. She'd send him screenshots of things she thought would make him laugh during work. She kept snacks in her bag because he skipped lunch too often. She learned exactly how he liked his coffee. She never announced any of it. Never said, "Look how thoughtful I am." She just did it. Every single day. Then another memory arrived. One he'd almost forgotten. They'd been walking through a grocery store. He was distracted. Thinking about work. Answering emails. Barely present. At one point she reached over and quietly took the shopping basket from his hand. He hadn't even noticed how tired his arm was. She smiled. I've got it. That was it. Nothing romantic. Nothing dramatic. The memory lasted maybe 8 seconds. Why was he remembering that now? Out of everything? He sat there confused. His own brain had chosen that moment. Not anniversaries. Not vacations. Not their first kiss. A grocery basket. Maybe because love lives in places our ego doesn't bother recording. Until loss starts searching through the archives. He wondered something that made him uncomfortable. Did she ever get tired? The thought landed heavily. Because he'd never asked. Not seriously. Whenever she'd say, "I'm exhausted," he'd assume she meant work. Maybe she did. Maybe she also meant this. The constant reaching. The constant noticing. The constant emotional awareness. The invisible maintenance nobody thanked her for because it was working. You only notice maintenance after something breaks. He remembered one conversation. At the time it seemed insignificant. She'd looked at him across the couch. Not angry. Not crying. Just quiet. And she'd asked, "Do you ever notice the little things?" He answered too quickly. "Of course I do." She nodded. "Okay." Looking back. That okay sounded different. It wasn't agreement. It was resignation. He didn't hear it then. He hears it now. Funny how memory changes its subtitles years later. There was another truth he hated admitting. Part of him had started expecting her emotional consistency. Not appreciating it. Expecting it. If she took longer than usual to reply. He noticed. If she seemed distracted. He wondered what was wrong. If she forgot something once. It felt unusual. Because she'd set such a high standard that anything less suddenly stood out. Yet he almost never noticed the hundreds of days she quietly showed up exactly the same. Humans are strange. Consistency becomes invisible. Change becomes everything. He sat on the edge of his bed one night. Phone in his hand. Her chat still pinned near the top. He didn't open it. He just stared at her name. "I appreciated her." The sentence came out softly. The quieter voice answered almost immediately. "You appreciated having her." Silence. That's different. He hated that sentence. Because it wasn't completely wrong. Appreciating someone's presence. And appreciating what they're constantly choosing to give. Aren't always the same thing. He'd loved her. There's no question about that. But somewhere along the way, he'd stopped seeing the effort inside her love. It had become part of the wallpaper. Always there. Never examined. Never questioned. Never imagined as something that could actually disappear. By the time he finally understood how much emotional weight she'd been carrying, she wasn't carrying it anymore. Not because she suddenly became cold. Not because she stopped loving. Because she could no longer keep pouring herself into a space where her effort had become invisible. And maybe that's the hardest lesson of all. Love rarely disappears in one dramatic moment. Sometimes, it slowly exhausts itself trying to remain visible to someone who has grown accustomed to its light. He would spend a long time replaying that realization. Not because it made him feel like a villain. It didn't. It made him feel painfully human. Because the most difficult truth wasn't that he had never loved her. It was that he had loved her, while quietly assuming that her reaching would always be there tomorrow. Until one day, tomorrow arrived. And for the first time since he'd known her, it didn't. People imagine heartbreak as an explosion. One conversation. One goodbye. One final message that changes everything. But that's rarely how it feels. Most of the time, silence doesn't arrive like thunder. It arrives like dust. Almost invisible. You don't notice it settling until one day you realize everything around you has been quietly covered. That's what happened to him. Nothing dramatic happened after she stopped reaching. No desperate phone calls. No emotional confrontations. No late-night declarations of love. Life simply continued. He still woke up at the same time every morning. Still made coffee. Still drove the same roads to work. Still complained about traffic. Still laughed when his coworkers made terrible jokes. If someone had looked at him from the outside, they would have said, "He seems okay." Maybe he even believed that himself. Because grief has an odd habit of disguising itself as normal life. Until ordinary moments begin betraying you. The first thing he noticed wasn't pain. It was interruption. Tiny interruptions. He'd hear something funny during lunch. Someone would tell an absurd story. Everyone laughed. He laughed too. And before he could stop himself, his hand reached toward his phone. Not consciously. Just automatically. He wanted to tell her. Not because the story mattered. Because somewhere inside his brain, she had become the person who received all the small things. He unlocked his phone. Opened the messages. Stared at their conversation. Then locked it again. Nobody around him noticed. The entire moment lasted maybe 7 seconds. 7 quiet seconds. That was all. But somehow, those 7 seconds followed him home. The hardest losses aren't always people. Sometimes they're destinations. When you've spent months or years sharing your inner world with someone, your mind develops a direction. Every random thought has somewhere to go. Every strange observation has an audience. Every stupid joke has a witness. Then suddenly, there's nowhere to send any of it. It's like writing letters after the mailbox has disappeared. You still know how to write. You just don't know where to place the words. He began collecting stories that never reached anyone. The elderly man who danced while waiting for the bus. The little girl who insisted on carrying groceries bigger than she was. The coffee shop employee who accidentally wrote Batman instead of his name on the cup. Tiny moments. Completely insignificant. Yet somehow, they felt unfinished. Because love isn't built only through extraordinary conversations. It's built through the accumulation of ordinary ones. Thousands of moments that seem meaningless alone. Together, they become a shared life. One evening he walked into a grocery store. Nothing unusual. He grabbed a shopping basket. Started moving through familiar aisles. Bread. Eggs. Milk. Coffee. Without thinking, he picked up her favorite chocolate. His hand froze halfway toward the basket. He stared at it. A strange feeling settled in his chest. He wasn't buying it for anyone anymore. He slowly put it back on the shelf. Nobody saw. Nobody cared. But something inside him whispered. You still remembered. Memory doesn't disappear when relationships end. It keeps performing old routines. Long after reality has changed. Psychologists sometimes talk about prediction. The brain is constantly predicting what happens next. Not just danger. Everything. You expect the floor beneath your feet. You expect your front door to open. You expect your favorite cafe to smell like coffee. Relationships become predictions too. His brain kept predicting her. Not because she was physically there. Because she had been emotionally consistent for so long. Morning. She'll probably text. Lunch. Maybe she'll send something funny. Evening. We'll probably talk. Those predictions didn't disappear overnight. Reality kept violating them. Again. And again. And again. The strange ache he felt wasn't only emotional. It was neurological. His brain was repeatedly expecting connection. And repeatedly finding empty space. He never would have explained it that way. He would have simply said, I've been feeling off lately. Sometimes off is just another word for a nervous system trying to rewrite its map of the world. At work, he became slightly more distracted. Nothing major. Just enough to notice. He'd read the same email twice. Walk into a room and forget why. Leave his coffee somewhere and spend 10 minutes looking for it. His coworker joked. You're getting old. He laughed. Maybe. But he knew that wasn't it. His attention kept drifting toward something invisible. Like hearing a song from another room that nobody else could hear. Night became the hardest part. Days have structure. Meetings. Errands. noise, responsibilities. Night removes all of that. Silence expands after dark. He found himself staying awake longer than usual. Scrolling. Watching videos he wasn't really interested in. Reading comment sections. Refreshing apps for no reason. He wasn't looking for entertainment. He was postponing stillness. Because stillness had started asking uncomfortable questions. Do you miss her? No. A pause. I miss talking to someone. Another pause. Isn't that the same thing? No. Longer silence. That isn't it. He hated conversations like this. Not because anyone else was asking them. Because they came from inside. There's nowhere to walk away from your own questions. One Friday after work, his friends invited him out. He said yes immediately. He laughed. Drank. Stayed later than usual. For several hours. He genuinely enjoyed himself. Driving home around midnight. The city looked peaceful. Traffic lights blinking over nearly empty streets. Music playing softly. He smiled. Maybe he really was moving on. Then he reached his apartment. Unlocked the door. Stepped inside. The apartment greeted him with complete silence. No one asking, "How was your night?" No sleepy smile from the couch. No light left on in the kitchen. No voice. Just the refrigerator humming. He stood in the hallway much longer than necessary. The loneliness hadn't followed him all evening. It had simply been waiting at home. Funny thing about empty apartments. They sound different depending on your emotional state. When you're content, they feel peaceful. When you're grieving, they echo. He never believed people who talked about houses feeling empty. Now he understood. Nothing had physically changed. The furniture was exactly where he'd left it. The photographs hadn't moved. The walls hadn't grown larger. Yet somehow, everything felt farther apart. Even the distance from the couch to the kitchen seemed longer. Grief changes geometry. A few weeks passed. People stopped asking about her. Friends assume silence means healing. Sometimes silence only means people have stopped checking. He appreciated that. And hated it at the same time. He wanted normal conversations. He also wanted someone to accidentally mention her. Just enough to know she still existed somewhere outside his own thoughts. Isn't that strange? Sometimes we don't want people back. We simply don't want them erased. Then something happened that genuinely surprised him. He forgot her voice. Not completely. Just the exact sound. He could remember what she'd say. Not precisely how she'd sound saying it. That frightened him. He closed his eyes. Tried hearing her laugh. It came back blurry. Like listening to an old recording underwater. Memory preserves emotion longer than detail. That realization hurt more than he'd expected. Because forgetting wasn't betrayal. It was time doing what time always does. Quietly editing. One afternoon he found an old voice message. He hadn't realized it was still there. Nothing important. She'd been laughing because she'd gotten lost trying to find a bookstore. 34 seconds. That was all. He listened once. Then again. Then again. Not because of what she was saying. Because of the spaces between the words. The little breaths. The background traffic. The way she laughed halfway through a sentence. Those details suddenly felt priceless. Months earlier, he probably would have skipped through the message. Now, 34 seconds felt like borrowed time. He started wondering what she was doing. Not in an obsessive way. Just. Occasionally. Was she still taking the long route home because she liked driving past the river? Had she finally finished that novel she'd been reading forever? Did she still order the same coffee? Was someone else hearing about the funny things that happened during her day? That last question stayed with him. Not because he was jealous. because he realized someone else would eventually inherit all the little stories. Someone else would become her destination. That thought landed heavier than expected. Loss becomes real when you realize life hasn't paused for the other person either. She wasn't frozen inside his memories. She was continuing. Living. Growing. Changing. Without him witnessing any of it. That's a difficult truth. We secretly imagine people remaining exactly where we left them. Real life refuses to cooperate. He looked back at their old messages one night. Not to torture himself. At least that's what he claimed. He scrolled upward. Weeks. Months. He noticed something he'd never paid attention to before. Most conversations began with her. Most difficult conversations ended with her reaching first. Most plans happened because she'd suggested them. He frowned. Was it always like this? Apparently. Yes. He'd simply never noticed the pattern while living inside it. Silence has a cruel way of revealing structures that noise concealed. Then came the smallest moment of all. One Sunday afternoon. He accidentally saw someone who looked like her from behind. Same height. Same hair. Same jacket. His heartbeat jumped before logic had time to intervene. He actually smiled. For half a second. His entire body believed she was there. The woman turned around. Wrong person. The smile disappeared almost immediately. He kept walking. Nobody noticed. But as he crossed the street, he quietly laughed to himself. My body still doesn't know. That's when he understood something important. Healing isn't linear because memory isn't logical. The nervous system doesn't consult calendars. It doesn't care that weeks have passed. It simply recognizes familiar shapes. Voices. Movements. Possibilities. Then reacts before reason catches up. By now, the silence no longer felt temporary. It had become part of his life. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just. Present. Like weather. Some mornings it barely existed. Other days it followed him everywhere. He finally realized why people say absence grows instead of shrinks. Not because the person becomes larger. Because life keeps creating new spaces where they would have been. Every new experience asks, who do you tell now? Every ordinary day quietly repeats the same question. And eventually, he stopped fearing the silence itself. He began fearing what it was teaching him. Because the silence wasn't empty anymore. It had started speaking. And for the first time since she stopped reaching, he was finally quiet enough to hear what it had been trying to say all along. The strangest part of emotional loss is that your mind and your body don't always receive the news at the same time. His mind had already written the story. It's over. Life goes on. I'll be okay. He repeated those sentences so often that they almost sounded true. His friends believed him. His co-workers believed him. Sometimes, he even believed himself. But the body tells a much slower truth. Because while the ego speaks in language, the nervous system speaks in habits. And habits don't disappear because you've made a decision. They disappear because time slowly teaches the body that the world has changed. That lesson takes much longer than pride expects. He noticed it first in the mornings. Nothing dramatic. His alarm rang. He reached for his phone before he was fully awake. Not to check the weather. Not to read the news. His thumb automatically searched for her conversation. Sometimes he opened it before realizing what he was doing. Sometimes he caught himself halfway. He would stare at the screen for a second, then quietly lock the phone again. No one ever saw those moments. They happened in complete silence. Tiny rituals performed by a nervous system that still believed connection was part of waking up. His ego immediately stepped in. You're just bored. Everyone checks their phone. This doesn't mean anything. Maybe. Or maybe his body had memorized a relationship that his pride was pretending had already disappeared. It's fascinating how often we mistake emotional adaptation for weakness. Especially men. We're taught to recover quickly. Stay composed. Stay productive. Don't overthink. Don't dwell. Don't make yourself look pathetic. So instead of asking, "What am I actually feeling?" we ask, "How can I stop feeling this?" They're completely different questions. One creates understanding. The other creates suppression. And suppression has an interesting habit. It almost always leaks. Just somewhere unexpected. He wasn't crying. He wasn't begging. He wasn't calling her every night. So naturally, he concluded he was healing. But healing isn't measured by the absence of visible emotion. Sometimes it's measured by how hard you're working not to feel anything. There's a difference. A very expensive difference. One afternoon his coworker asked a simple question. "You seem tired lately." He laughed. "I've just been sleeping badly." That answer sounded reasonable. Except, he'd never asked himself why. He blamed work. Coffee. Stress. The weather. Anything except the obvious possibility that his nervous system no longer felt as safe as it once had. Safety is strange. Most people think safety means being protected from danger. Emotionally, it often means knowing someone consistently exists. Someone answers. Someone notices. Someone remembers. Someone is there. Take that away. And your body doesn't always recognize the difference between emotional uncertainty and physical threat. That's why heartbreak can feel exhausting. Your nervous system spends weeks scanning for something that no longer exists. He began waking up around 3 a.m. Almost every night. No nightmares. No panic. Just awake. He'd stare at the ceiling. Listen to the quiet apartment. Roll over. Try sleeping again. His mind stayed relatively calm. His body didn't. It felt restless. Unsettled. As if something important had been forgotten. Eventually he'd get up. Drink water. Walk through the apartment. Then return to bed. The next morning he'd tell himself, "I'm probably just stressed." Stress. Such a useful word. It explains everything. Which sometimes means it explains nothing. The ego loves simple explanations. I'm busy. I'm tired. I'm overworked. Those explanations protect identity. Because admitting, "I miss someone who stopped reaching for me," requires vulnerability. And vulnerability threatens pride. So the ego edits reality. Not maliciously. Protectively. Like an overzealous lawyer trying to defend a client who's already confessed. He noticed another strange habit. He started working longer hours. Volunteering for extra projects. Taking fewer breaks. His manager complimented him. "Really appreciate your dedication." He smiled. "Thanks." Inside, he wasn't chasing success. He was chasing exhaustion. Because exhausted people fall asleep faster. Or at least, they hope they will. Our culture praises distraction. We call it ambition. Productivity. Grinding. Sometimes it genuinely is. Other times, it's grief wearing business clothes. His weekends changed too. He stopped sitting still. Saturday morning, gym. Afternoon, errands. Evening, friends. Sunday, laundry. Shopping. Cleaning. Meal prep. Anything. Movement became medicine. Until movement became avoidance. Because stillness remained dangerous. Stillness invited memory. One Sunday, everything was finished. The apartment was spotless. Laundry folded. Groceries organized. Emails answered. Nothing left to do. He looked around. Sat on the couch. 5 minutes passed. Then he reached for the television. Changed his mind. Opened his phone. Closed it again. Stood up. Made coffee he didn't actually want. Walked to the window. Looked outside. Sat down again. The room hadn't changed. Only one thing had become impossible to ignore. Himself. That's the uncomfortable thing about silence. Eventually, it removes every distraction until you're left facing the one conversation you've been postponing. His ego started speaking first. You're fine. You've made progress. You haven't contacted her. You're functioning. The quieter voice asked only one question. Then why can't you relax? Silence. Because it was true. Even during peaceful moments. His body rarely felt peaceful. He constantly felt like he should be doing something. Fixing something. Checking something. Moving towards something. As if resting itself had become unsafe. There's a biological reason for this. When someone becomes a secure emotional figure in your life, your nervous system begins regulating itself through repeated connection. A familiar voice. A familiar presence. A predictable response. Not because you're weak. Because that's how human attachment works. When that regulation suddenly disappears, the body doesn't immediately learn self-regulation overnight. It spends time searching for the missing pattern. The ego says, I'm independent. The nervous system quietly asks, then where did everyone go? He remembered something she'd once told him. You don't really tell me when something's wrong. He'd shrugged. I deal with things myself. She smiled gently. I know. At the time, he'd considered that one of his strengths. Now, he wondered if it had always been one of his greatest defenses. Maybe dealing with everything alone wasn't emotional maturity. Maybe it was emotional isolation wearing mature clothes. He thought back over the relationship. Whenever he felt anxious, she usually noticed first. Whenever work overwhelmed him, she somehow sensed it before he admitted it. Whenever life became chaotic, she quietly slowed herself down. He hadn't realized she'd often been helping regulate emotions he believed he was managing alone. That's what secure people sometimes do. They calm storms so quietly. You start believing there was never any weather. Without her, small frustrations felt larger. Traffic irritated him more. Customer service calls exhausted him faster. Tiny inconveniences accumulated. He became impatient. Short-tempered. Not dramatically. Just. Slightly less resilient. He blamed adulthood. Maybe adulthood deserved some blame. But maybe his emotional reserves had simply become smaller. When we're connected, our capacity expands. When we're emotionally depleted, even ordinary life feels heavier. One evening he snapped at a cashier. Nothing terrible. Just unnecessarily impatient. As he walked back to his car, he felt embarrassed. Why did I react like that? The cashier wasn't the problem. The long line wasn't the problem. The wrong receipt wasn't the problem. Sometimes the nervous system can't release emotion where it belongs. So it releases it wherever the door happens to be unlocked. The ego hates this explanation. Because it prefers control. I chose that. I handled that. I decided. But bodies aren't democratic. They don't wait for permission before reacting. They remember. They anticipate. They protect. Even when protection no longer looks rational. He also noticed how often he checked his phone without purpose. Not to message anyone. Just checking. Notifications. Weather. Time. Back to notifications. Again. And again. It wasn't information he wanted. It was possibility. Possibility that someone might be reaching. Possibility that something unexpected had happened. Possibility that the silence wasn't permanent after all. Every empty screen quietly answered the same question. No, not today. Weeks became months. Externally, he improved. He smiled more naturally. Worked well. Spent time with friends. Started laughing again. If someone had met him then, they would have described him as perfectly okay. That's the dangerous thing about appearances. They measure performance, not regulation. One afternoon, he walked through a bookstore. He wasn't looking for anything specific. As he wandered through the psychology section, one sentence in a book caught his attention. Your body keeps the score of experiences your mind has already explained away. He stood there longer than expected. The sentence unsettled him. Because suddenly, everything made sense. The sleepless nights, the restless weekends, the compulsive checking, the inability to fully relax. His mind had accepted the ending. His body hadn't. He bought the book. Not because he thought it would fix him. Because for the first time, someone had described an experience he hadn't known how to name. Sometimes healing begins the moment suffering receives language. Not because the pain disappears. Because confusion does. That night, instead of distracting himself, he simply sat in the quiet. No television. No music. No scrolling. Just breathing. At first, his thoughts raced everywhere. Work. Bills. Random memories. Things he needed to buy. Then, beneath all that noise, one feeling slowly emerged. Not panic. Not desperation. Sadness. Simple. Uncomplicated sadness. He realized he'd been trying to outrun it for weeks. Maybe months. And strangely, the moment he stopped running, it became smaller. Not gone. Just honest. The ego immediately whispered, "You're falling apart." The quieter voice answered, "No. You're finally standing still. There's a difference. One is collapse. The other is contact. Contact with reality." He finally understood why pretending to be fine had been so exhausting. Because pretending requires constant maintenance. The nervous system never believed the performance. It had been sending signals all along. Sleeplessness. Restlessness. Hypervigilance. Distraction. Not as punishment. As communication. The body had never been trying to sabotage him. It had been trying to finish a conversation the ego refused to have. And perhaps that's the quiet turning point so many people never recognize. Healing doesn't begin when you convince yourself you've moved on. It begins when the mind finally stops arguing with the body. When pride grows quiet enough to admit, I wasn't as unaffected as I wanted everyone to believe. Because the strongest men are not the ones who never feel loss. They're the ones who eventually stop treating their own nervous system like an enemy. Only then does the body slowly stop searching for what is gone. Only then does silence stop feeling like danger. And only then does the first real breath after heartbreak quietly arrive. There comes a point in almost every meaningful loss when memory changes its strategy. At first, the mind remembers the ending. The final conversation, the silence, the unanswered messages, the day everything became different. But after enough time has passed, something curious begins to happen. The ending slowly fades into the background. And the smallest moments, the ones that seem too ordinary to matter, begin quietly asking for attention. Not because they suddenly became important, because they always were. He simply hadn't known it yet. One evening, while washing dishes, he remembered the way she used to stand beside him in the kitchen. Not talking. Not helping. Just being there. Sometimes she'd lean against the counter scrolling through her phone. Sometimes she'd steal pieces of fruit while pretending she wasn't hungry. Sometimes she'd tell him stories that had absolutely no point. He couldn't remember the details of a single story, but he remembered how peaceful the room had felt. Funny, isn't it? Memory often preserves atmosphere better than information. He stopped washing the dishes halfway through. His hands rested in the warm water. For a few seconds, he wasn't in his apartment anymore. He was back inside a Tuesday evening that neither of them had considered special. That realization hurt. Because no one warns you that one day you'll miss the moments you barely noticed while they were happening. There's a psychological phenomenon called emotional reconstruction. We don't replay memories like video recordings. We rebuild them, piece by piece, feeling by feeling. Every time we remember someone, our brain reconstructs the experience, which means what we notice changes over time. At first, he remembered the arguments. Now, he remembered how she'd quietly straightened the collar of his jacket before they left the house. Not because she cared about appearances, because she cared about him. He hadn't even thanked her. Not once. His mind began collecting these tiny scenes. The way she'd automatically move closer when crossing a busy street. The way she'd lower the volume whenever he looked tired. The way she'd notice when he skipped lunch. The way she'd remember things he'd casually mentioned months earlier. He realized something uncomfortable. None of those moments had demanded attention. Love rarely does. It simply continues, hoping someone notices. The ego loves dramatic gestures, grand confessions, expensive gifts, spectacular apologies. They're easy to recognize. Quiet devotion is harder. It disappears into routine, until routine disappears. Then suddenly, it becomes impossible to ignore. One Saturday morning he made coffee. As he reached for the sugar, he instinctively grabbed 2 mugs. He froze, stared at them, then slowly returned one to the cabinet. The entire interaction lasted less than 10 seconds. Yet somehow, it felt heavier than entire conversations he'd had with other people. Because habits reveal attachment more honestly than declarations ever could. People often ask, when did you realize you loved someone? Rarely do they ask, when did you realize how much they loved you? Those are different questions. The second one usually arrives much later. Sometimes, too late. He remembered rainy afternoons. Not because anything extraordinary happened. Because she always carried an umbrella. Always. Even when the forecast promised sunshine. He used to tease her. You're preparing for a storm that doesn't exist. She'd smile. And if it rains? It won't. Sometimes. It did. He laughed quietly as he remembered standing under that unnecessary umbrella. Back then, he'd thought she was overly cautious. Now he wondered if that was simply how she loved. Prepared. Attentive. Thinking ahead. Protecting both of them from discomfort before discomfort even arrived. Love often looks like prevention, not performance. We rarely celebrate the arguments that never happened. The disasters someone quietly prevented. The emotional labor someone carried before it ever became visible. Yet those invisible acts shape entire relationships. He started noticing how frequently she'd adjusted herself around him. Not dramatically. Almost invisibly. She'd choose restaurants he liked. Movies he'd probably enjoy. Driving routes that made him less anxious. Conversations that made him comfortable. She wasn't losing herself. She was making room for him. There's a difference. One is self-abandonment. The other is generosity. He wondered, had he ever really seen it? Or had he mistaken her adaptability for personality? Memory became strangely specific. He remembered the sound of her keys hitting the kitchen counter every evening. He remembered how she'd leave cabinet doors slightly open. He remembered the tiny wrinkle that appeared beside her eyes when she genuinely laughed. He remembered that she always read the last page of a book much slower than the rest. Why these details? Why not the anniversaries? Why not birthdays? Because attachment isn't built through milestones. It's built through repetition. The nervous system remembers patterns, not calendars. One afternoon, he found himself smiling over something ridiculous. She used to mispronounce one particular word. Every single time. He had corrected her dozens of times. She'd roll her eyes. I know. Then she'd intentionally say it wrong again. At the time, he found it mildly annoying. Now, he laughed out loud in an empty apartment. He would have listened to that wrong pronunciation 1,000 more times if given the chance. Funny how absence edits irritation into affection. He also remembered the things she worried about. Whether he'd eaten enough. Whether he was driving safely. Whether he'd remembered his appointment. Whether he looked exhausted. He used to think, she worries too much. Now he realized, someone worrying about you is one of the quietest forms of love. Not because worry itself is romantic. Because attention is. You don't worry about people you don't emotionally carry. There was one memory that kept returning. It wasn't romantic. Not really. They had been grocery shopping. She'd wandered off somewhere. A few minutes later, she returned holding his favorite snack. I saw this. That was it. Nothing dramatic. No speech. No occasion. Just 4 simple words. I saw this. He finally understood why the memory wouldn't leave him. It wasn't about the snack. It was about what those words actually meant. I was thinking about you. Even while we weren't together. That realization settled deep inside him. Being remembered by someone might be one of the most intimate experiences a human being can have. The more he replayed these memories, the less he focused on what she'd said. Instead, he noticed how she'd made him feel. Calmer. Seen. Expected. Known. Not constantly excited. Something deeper. Regulated. There's an important distinction. Excitement is addictive. Safety is often invisible. Until it's gone. He thought about all the times he'd mistaken calm for ordinary. He'd believed love should always feel intense. Passionate. Electrifying. Instead, she'd quietly built something else. Predictability. Consistency. Reliability. Those things rarely create butterflies. They create home. The tragedy is that many people only recognize home after they've already walked away from it. He remembered one particular evening. He'd had a terrible day at work. Nothing catastrophic. Just one of those days where everything seemed unnecessarily difficult. He came home irritated. Barely spoke. She didn't pressure him. Didn't interrogate him. She simply placed dinner on the table. Sat nearby. Waited. 20 minutes later, he started talking on his own. Back then, he'd assumed he'd calmed himself down. Now, he wondered if she'd simply created enough emotional safety for his nervous system to settle. Sometimes people don't solve your problems. They solve your environment. And inside a peaceful environment, problems naturally become smaller. The hardest memories weren't the romantic ones. They were the completely forgettable afternoons. Watching television. Folding laundry. Waiting in traffic. Shopping for toothpaste. Eating takeout on the living room floor because neither of them wanted to wash dishes. Life. Just. Life. He realized something painful. He had spent years waiting for extraordinary moments, while someone beside him had quietly transformed ordinary moments into a meaningful life. One night he found an old photograph. Neither of them was looking at the camera. She was laughing at something he'd said. He was looking at her. Not dramatically. Not lovingly. Just. Naturally. The photographer must have caught the moment between poses. He stared at it for a long time. Then noticed something he'd never seen before. She wasn't laughing because of the camera. She was laughing because she felt safe enough to forget it was there. Safety changes faces. People smile differently when they don't feel observed. He suddenly wondered how many beautiful moments he'd failed to recognize simply because he'd been expecting bigger ones. We often imagine love arrives with fireworks. In reality, it often arrives carrying groceries, waiting in parking lots, sending reminders, saving your favorite seat, remembering your coffee order, charging your phone because you forgot, texting, drive carefully. Tiny things. Repeated enough times, they become someone's emotional climate. As weeks passed, his memories became less painful. Not because they mattered less, because they became more complete. He stopped replaying them to torture himself. He replayed them because they were finally teaching him something. The relationship had never been built on spectacular moments. It had been built on thousands of nearly invisible choices. Choices she'd made every single day. Often without acknowledgement. Often without applause. Simply because loving him had become part of how she moved through the world. He asked himself a question that lingered long after midnight. How many times did she feel unseen while doing all those little things? He had no answer. Only silence. Sometimes, regret doesn't come from the wrong things we did. It comes from the beautiful things we failed to recognize while they were quietly happening beside us. His ego still wanted to remember the relationship through big events. The first date. The vacations. The anniversaries. The breakup. His heart kept returning somewhere else. To grocery stores. Coffee mugs. Rainy sidewalks. Inside jokes. Quiet kitchens. Half-finished conversations. Because those places contained something far more important than excitement. They contained evidence. Evidence that love had been present. Long before he learned how to see it. And somewhere inside those ordinary memories, a painful realization was slowly taking shape. Perhaps he hadn't fallen in love with her after she was gone. Perhaps he was only now becoming capable of seeing the love that had surrounded him all along. There is a moment in almost every separation when the person you lost stops existing exactly as they were. Not because they changed, because your mind did. At first, memory behaves like a courtroom. It gathers evidence. It argues. It searches for someone to blame. One day she's selfish. The next day she's misunderstood. One moment he convinces himself she gave up too easily. The next, he wonders if she stayed longer than anyone else would have. The story keeps changing. Not because the past is changing. Because grief is. When people think about memory, they often imagine it as a photograph. Something fixed. Untouched. Permanent. But memory is alive. Every time we remember someone, we don't simply retrieve the memory. We recreate it. We add understanding we didn't have before. We remove assumptions that no longer fit. We notice details we once ignored. In many ways, the person we carry inside us continues evolving, even after we've stopped speaking to them. For months, he had remembered her through the lens of the breakup. Everything before it had been colored by disappointment. Every happy memory seemed followed by an invisible sentence. But it didn't last. That sentence poisoned everything. Until one afternoon, it quietly disappeared. He wasn't trying to think about her. He was sitting in a cafe reading. A woman at the next table laughed. Not because she sounded like her. She didn't. But there was something familiar about the softness of the laugh. Not the sound. The feeling. For a brief moment, his chest tightened. Then relaxed. He smiled without sadness. That surprised him. Because for the first time, remembering her didn't immediately hurt. It simply felt warm. Psychologists sometimes describe grief as moving from acute pain to integrated memory. The person doesn't disappear. They simply stop feeling like an open wound. They become part of your emotional landscape. Like an old hometown. You no longer live there. But part of you always knows the streets. He noticed something else changing. When people mentioned her, he no longer rushed to defend himself. In the beginning, he had always needed a story. It just wasn't working. We wanted different things. It was mutual. She had her issues too. The explanations made him feel safer. As though if he could organize the breakup into neat sentences, he wouldn't have to sit with the messiness of loss. Now, someone would casually ask, "How is she?" And he'd simply answer, "I don't know." No bitterness. No performance. Just truth. The need to justify had quietly disappeared. One evening, he found an old voice note. Not the 34-second message he'd listened to before. A different one. She wasn't saying anything important. She was describing a sunset she'd seen on the drive home. Halfway through, she interrupted herself. "Oh, I forgot you probably can't see this." Then she laughed. "I'll show you later." The recording ended there. He listened again. Then again. Not because of the sunset. Because he'd finally noticed something he'd completely missed back then. She wanted to share beauty with him. Not because it solved a problem. Not because it required a response. Simply because experiencing something beautiful had made her think of him. That realization settled into him differently now. Months earlier, he would have listened for what she said. Now, he listened for why she said it. As people mature emotionally, they often stop evaluating relationships by events. Instead, they begin evaluating intentions. Intentions are quieter, harder to notice, but infinitely more revealing. He started asking different questions. Not, why did she leave? Instead, what was she trying to give me all those years? Those two questions lead to completely different destinations. The version of her in his mind slowly became softer. Not idealized. Not perfect. Just human. He remembered that she overthought everything. That she occasionally became distant when overwhelmed. That she sometimes expected him to understand things she'd never actually said. She had flaws. Real ones. But strangely, those flaws no longer irritated him. They made her feel more complete. Something inside him had shifted. In the beginning, he had been trying to decide whether she was right or wrong. Now, he was simply trying to understand who she really was. Understanding is very different from judgment. Judgment asks, who's guilty? Understanding asks, what was this person carrying? He thought about all the moments she'd seemed unusually quiet. At the time, he'd assumed she was upset with him. Maybe sometimes she was. But maybe she had simply been tired, anxious, overstimulated, afraid. He had interpreted every silence through himself. Now, he wondered what it had actually been like to live inside her world. That question changed everything. Empathy often arrives too late. Not because we're cruel. Because while we're inside a relationship, we're usually busy protecting our own perspective. Only distance creates enough space to see another person's reality. It's one of love's cruelest paradoxes. Sometimes, we become capable of understanding someone only after we've lost access to them. He remembered an argument they'd had over something completely insignificant. She'd canceled dinner plans. He'd felt disappointed. She apologized repeatedly. At the time, he thought she was overreacting. Now he remembered something she'd quietly mentioned afterward. I hate feeling like I let people down. He hadn't asked why. He hadn't thought to. Today, he wished he had. Because maybe the canceled dinner had never been the real story. Maybe she'd been carrying years of pressure to never disappoint anyone. He had only seen the behavior. He'd missed the history behind it. That's one of the most important psychological shifts after loss. You stop remembering behavior. You begin imagining context. Context creates compassion. Compassion doesn't erase accountability. It simply reminds us that every reaction has roots. Every defense protected something once. Every withdrawal solved a problem before it created another. Every person arrives in love carrying invisible maps they didn't draw themselves. She had hers. He had his. Neither of them had fully understood either map. He also noticed something unsettling. His memories no longer centered around what she'd done for him. Instead, they centered around who she had been. Curious. Patient. Sensitive. Quietly funny. The relationship had once occupied the center of every memory. Now, her humanity did. That's when he realized he was no longer grieving only what they'd shared. He was grieving someone unique. Someone who would never exist again in exactly the same way. He wondered whether she had changed. Probably. Everyone does. Maybe she'd found new routines. New cafes. New friends. Maybe someone else now knew which tea she ordered. Which movies made her cry. Which songs she skipped halfway through. That thought stung. Not because another man might know those things. Because time had continued introducing her to new versions of herself. Without him there to witness them. He would forever remember one edition of her. Life had already moved on to another. People often think grief is about wanting someone back. Sometimes, it's about mourning the future versions of them you'll never get to meet. The haircut you'll never see. The stories you'll never hear. The dreams they'll accomplish without you. The jokes they'll make with someone else. Loss isn't only about the past. It's also about every future that quietly disappears. One afternoon, he passed by the bookstore where they'd once spent hours wandering separate aisles before meeting again near the checkout. Without thinking, he walked inside. Everything looked the same. The wooden shelves. The soft music. The smell of paper. Yet somehow, everything felt different. Because she wasn't there to walk toward. He suddenly realized. Places don't become meaningful because of architecture. They become meaningful because of association. Memory quietly transforms ordinary locations into emotional landmarks. He picked up a novel she'd once recommended. At the time, he dismissed it. Not really my type. Now, he bought it. Not because he'd suddenly become interested in the genre. Because he wanted to understand another small piece of the world through her eyes. He wondered how many opportunities to know her he'd ignored simply because they hadn't interested him then. Love isn't only about being understood. It's also about becoming curious enough to understand someone else. As he read the book over the next few days, he found himself underlining passages. Not because they reminded him of himself. Because they reminded him of her. Her tenderness. Her tendency to notice overlooked people. Her quiet optimism. For the first time, he wasn't remembering the relationship. He was remembering the woman. Those are not the same thing. His ego had once reduced her to a role. My girlfriend. My partner. The person who left. His heart had finally restored her individuality. She had existed before him. She continued existing after him. She was never simply a character inside his story. She had always been the author of her own. That realization humbled him. He also noticed that his anger had almost completely disappeared. Not because he'd forced forgiveness. Because understanding had quietly dissolved the need for enemies. It's difficult to hate someone once you've sincerely tried to understand what life felt like from inside their nervous system. You may still disagree. You may still recognize mistakes. But hatred rarely survives genuine curiosity. Late one night, he asked himself a question that frightened him. What if I never actually saw her clearly while we were together? The room stayed silent. Because somewhere deep inside, he already knew the answer. He had seen pieces, roles, functions, reactions. He had loved her. But perhaps he had loved the version of her that fit inside his own emotional world. Only now, with no expectations left, was he beginning to notice the whole person. Ironically, absence had made him a better observer than presence ever had. And perhaps this is one of heartbreak's quietest lessons. We don't only lose another person. Sometimes, we lose the illusion that we ever fully knew them. In its place, something far more beautiful begins to grow. Respect. Respect for the complexity they carried. Respect for the silent battles they never explained. Respect for the ordinary kindness they offered without demanding recognition. Because love matures in strange ways. At first, it asks, how does this person make me feel? Later, it asks, who is this person? When no one was paying attention. And somewhere inside that question, his image of her became less romantic, less idealized, and infinitely more real. For the first time since she stopped reaching, he wasn't remembering the woman he wished she had been. He was finally beginning to remember the woman she had quietly been all along. And that realization prepared him for the hardest truth yet. Because once you truly see who someone was, you inevitably begin to wonder what it cost them to keep loving you. There is a difference between someone who leaves because they stop loving you and someone who leaves because they no longer have the strength to keep reaching. From the outside, those two endings often look exactly the same. A goodbye, a closed door, an empty apartment, no more messages. But psychologically, they are worlds apart. One ends because love disappears. The other ends because hope does. And hope is often much harder to replace. For a long time, he told himself she had simply given up. The phrase protected him. It made the story easier. If she really loved me, she would have stayed. It sounded logical, clean, comforting. Until one evening, he found himself remembering something she'd said months before the breakup. Not during an argument. Not dramatically. Just quietly. Almost as if she wasn't expecting him to hear it. I'm getting tired. At the time, he assumed she meant work. Life. Stress. Now, he wasn't so sure. The human nervous system has limits. Not only physical ones. Emotional ones. Every relationship asks both people to invest attention, patience, repair, understanding. But when those investments happen in only one direction for too long, something inside begins to fatigue. Not overnight. Gradually. Like carrying grocery bags. At first, they feel manageable. After enough distance, even one more step feels impossible. He began replaying their last year together. Not looking for dramatic failures. Looking for patterns. And once he started noticing them, he couldn't stop. She had initiated almost every difficult conversation. She had asked, "Can we talk?" More times than he could count. She had been the one trying to understand. Trying to repair. Trying to reconnect. Each attempt had cost her something. He simply hadn't seen the cost. Emotional labor leaves invisible bruises. Because nothing appears broken. No blood. No broken bones. No public evidence. Just someone becoming a little quieter. A little slower to smile. A little less certain that reaching out will make a difference. One memory refused to leave him. They'd been sitting in the car after dinner. She looked out the window for a long time before speaking. "I miss us." He remembered answering almost immediately. "But we're together." He thought he'd reassured her. Now, he understood what she'd actually been saying. She hadn't been talking about physical proximity. She'd been talking about emotional closeness. Two people can share a couch, a bed, even a home, and still miss each other. He wished he had asked, "What do you mean?" Instead, he'd answered the question he wanted to hear, not the one she'd actually asked. Relationships rarely collapse during the loud moments. They weaken inside the quiet misunderstandings that never receive another conversation. He remembered how patient she'd been. Painfully patient. She didn't demand perfection. She asked for presence. Not expensive gifts. Not impossible promises. Just attention. Curiosity. Participation. Looking back, those requests suddenly felt heartbreakingly reasonable. There's a psychological concept known as learned helplessness. When repeated efforts produce no meaningful change, people eventually stop trying. Not because they stop caring, because the brain learns that effort no longer creates different outcomes. This doesn't happen only in laboratories. It happens in relationships. Imagine asking to be heard. Again, and again, and again. Imagine explaining the same emotional need in 10 different ways. Imagine hoping that this conversation, this weekend, this apology, will finally create something different. Eventually, hope begins to consume more energy than silence. That's often the moment exhaustion begins. He started remembering how many chances she'd actually given him. Not ultimatums. Chances. There is a difference. Ultimatums say, "Change now." Chances whisper, "I still believe you can." She had whispered. For a very long time. He remembered small sentences he'd barely noticed before. "I don't know how to explain this anymore. I've already told you. I don't want to fight. I just want us to understand each other." Back then, those words sounded repetitive. Now, they sounded like someone slowly running out of emotional oxygen. He wondered what it must have felt like for her. To repeatedly choose vulnerability, only to feel that nothing truly shifted. Vulnerability is expensive. Every honest conversation risks rejection. Every emotional confession asks another person, "Will you meet me here?" When the answer keeps feeling uncertain, the heart naturally becomes more cautious. Not colder. Just tired. He thought back to the last few months. She'd stopped arguing as much. He'd considered that progress. They were finally fighting less. Peace. He thought. Only now did he recognize what had actually happened. She hadn't become more satisfied. She'd become less hopeful. The absence of conflict is not always evidence of harmony. Sometimes, it's evidence that someone has stopped believing conflict can accomplish anything. That realization settled heavily inside him. Because silence can have two meanings. One says, "I feel safe." The other says, "I've stopped expecting to be understood." Only one of them heals relationships. One afternoon, he opened an old conversation thread. Not searching for a particular message. Just looking. He noticed something that made his stomach tighten. Over the course of several months, her messages became shorter. Not colder. Simpler. She still asked how his day was. Still reminded him to eat. Still wished him good night. But something had quietly disappeared. The paragraphs. The stories. The emotional invitations. It was as if she had slowly started speaking only the words she believed would survive. Everything else, she kept to herself. He wondered where all those unsent thoughts had gone. Into journals? Late-night tears? Conversations with friends? Long drives alone? Or perhaps, they had simply remained inside her. Some feelings never become language. They simply become fatigue. The hardest part wasn't realizing she'd suffered. It was realizing she'd often suffered beside him, while trying not to burden him with it. One memory returned with startling clarity. She had once apologized. For crying. "I'm sorry. I've just been emotional lately." He had hugged her, told her everything would be okay. But he never asked, "What have you been carrying?" Sometimes comfort is sincere, but incomplete. We rush to stop another person's pain, without first becoming curious about its source. He began noticing how often she'd minimized herself. "It's okay. Don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. I'm fine." How many times had those words actually meant the opposite? Not because she wanted him to read minds, because she'd grown afraid that telling the truth wouldn't change anything anyway. Love changes shape under repeated disappointment. At first, it reaches. Then it explains. Then it reminds. Then it negotiates. Then it waits. Finally, it grows quiet. Not because love disappeared, because it became exhausted. There's another misunderstanding people often have about breakups. They imagine the person who leaves makes the decision in one dramatic moment. Usually, the decision has been forming silently for months. Each disappointment leaves a tiny crack. Each unrepaired conversation widens it. Each lonely evening inside the relationship adds another layer. By the time the goodbye finally arrives, the emotional departure often happened long before. The body is simply catching up with what the heart already knows. He remembered the last time she'd reached for his hand in public. He couldn't remember letting go. But he remembered not squeezing back. Not intentionally. He'd simply been distracted, looking at something on his phone. That tiny moment, which meant nothing to him, might have meant everything to her. Relationships are rarely damaged by one catastrophic event. More often, they are shaped by thousands of moments where one nervous system reaches, and the other doesn't fully notice. The painful truth wasn't that he had been cruel. He hadn't. He hadn't wanted to hurt her. He hadn't woken up each morning deciding to neglect the relationship. The truth was quieter than that. He had become accustomed to her effort, comfortable inside it. He unconsciously assumed it would always be there. Not because he was malicious, because consistency creates invisibility. We stop noticing what never seems likely to disappear. Until it does. One night, he imagined their final conversation differently. Not changing what happened, changing how he listened. Instead of defending himself, he imagined asking, "How long have you been feeling this way?" Instead of explaining, "What have I missed?" Instead of promising, "I'll do better," he imagined saying, "I'm sorry you had to carry this alone." He knew imagination couldn't change history. But somehow, those imagined questions revealed everything the real conversation had lacked. Curiosity. Perhaps that is one of the deepest forms of love. Not solving. Not fixing. Not persuading. Simply becoming deeply curious about another person's inner world before it becomes too heavy for them to carry alone. Weeks turned into months. The anger he'd once believed she carried no longer seemed real. He replayed her final expression in his mind. There had been sadness, disappointment, compassion even. But rage? No. What he had mistaken for emotional distance might actually have been emotional depletion. She hadn't looked like someone trying to punish him. She had looked like someone who no longer had enough strength to keep asking for what she'd been asking for all along. To be met. To be heard. To feel less alone inside the relationship. That realization broke something inside him. Not his heart. His illusion. He had believed love ends in explosions. Sometimes, it ends in exhaustion. Not because one person stopped loving. Because loving had slowly become heavier than either of them realized. And perhaps that is the hardest truth of all. The people who love us most deeply are often willing to carry extraordinary emotional weight. Quietly. Without applause. Without keeping score. Until one day, they gently set the weight down. Not out of anger. Not out of revenge. simply because their hands can no longer hold it. And when he finally understood that, the breakup stopped looking like the day she walked away. It began looking like the final chapter of a story that had been asking for his attention. Long before either of them knew it was ending. There comes a moment, after enough silence, when the urge to reach out becomes almost impossible to ignore. Not because loneliness suddenly disappears. Not because the pain has been fully understood. But because memory has finally become honest. The anger has softened. The blame has lost its certainty. The nervous system has stopped fighting reality. And somewhere in the middle of an ordinary afternoon, his thumb hovers over her name. Not moving. Just waiting. People often imagine reconciliation beginning with courage. Sometimes it begins with hesitation. A message typed, deleted, typed again, a name searched, a profile opened, closed before anything is sent, the body leaning toward connection, while the ego quietly pulls it back. He tells himself he's only curious. He wonders how she's doing, whether she moved, whether she still drinks coffee before 9, whether she still avoids thunderstorms, whether she ever thinks about him. But underneath every practical question, there is another one, the one he cannot say out loud. Would she still answer if I reached out today? His mind begins rehearsing conversations that never happen. Hey, it's been a while. Too casual. I've been thinking about you. Too vulnerable. I hope you're doing well. Too distant. I'm sorry. Too heavy. Every sentence feels either too much or not enough. So he sends nothing. Psychologists sometimes describe this as an approach avoidance conflict. The same person becomes both the source of comfort and the reminder of pain. Part of him moves toward connection. Another part remembers rejection. Both impulses feel equally true. So instead of acting, he freezes. He opens their old conversation. Not to text. Just to look. The messages are frozen in time. A digital museum of two people who no longer exist. He scrolls slowly. He notices something strange. Her messages were always longer. His were often efficient. She asked questions. He answered them. She described feelings. He described events. She wrote, I miss hearing about your day. He replied, it was busy. At the time, that exchange seemed perfectly normal. Now, it feels painfully incomplete. Not because he lied. Because he had mistaken information. For intimacy. He realizes something uncomfortable. She hadn't wanted updates. She had wanted access. Access to his inner world. What worried him? What excited him? What frightened him? What he never learned to say. He had shared his schedule. She had been asking for his heart. That realization follows him everywhere. Driving home. Standing in line at the grocery store. Lying awake at night. It isn't guilt anymore. It's clarity. And clarity often hurts more than confusion. One evening, he begins typing. Hi. Just one word. He stares at it for nearly 5 minutes. Then deletes it. Not because he changes his mind. Because another voice interrupts. What if she's happier now? What if hearing from you only reopens her wounds? What if she ignores you? What if she replies politely? But nothing more? The human brain naturally predicts threats more vividly than possibilities. Embarrassment. Rejection. Humiliation. Those images arrive instantly. Hope takes much longer. Pride is often misunderstood. People imagine pride as arrogance, as confidence, as someone believing they're above everyone else. But much of the time, pride is simply fear wearing expensive clothes. Fear of hearing no. Fear of discovering you've become a stranger. fear of learning that life continued beautifully. Without you. He tells himself he's respecting her space. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's another way of protecting himself. The line between respect and avoidance can be surprisingly difficult to see. Attachment theory suggests that after separation, many people continue experiencing what researchers call protest behaviors. Checking social media, driving past familiar places, replaying conversations, imagining accidental meetings. Not because they are irrational, because the attachment system is still searching for reconnection. His nervous system has not yet accepted that the relationship belongs to memory. Part of him still believes one conversation could restore everything. Late one night, he finds himself looking through old photographs. Not the carefully posed ones, the accidental ones, the blurry pictures, the ones she'd taken when he wasn't paying attention. He notices something. Almost every candid photograph shows him looking away, watching television, cooking, driving, laughing with friends, living ordinary life. She had been watching him, not to judge, to remember. She had preserved moments he never realized were meaningful. Suddenly, he wonders how many beautiful things someone sees when they love you quietly. His finger drifts back toward her contact information. He imagines hearing her voice. Would it sound the same? Would she hesitate after saying hello? Would there be warmth? Distance? Kindness? Nothing. The uncertainty feels unbearable. And yet, certainty might be worse. Because certainty could mean discovering there is no longer any place for him inside her life. The ego prefers uncertainty. Hope can survive uncertainty. It cannot always survive answers. He starts imagining what he would actually say if she picked up. Not the rehearsed version. The honest one. I didn't understand. I thought there would always be another chance. I confused your patience with permanence. I see things differently now. He realizes something remarkable. None of those sentences ask her to come back. They simply acknowledge reality. Perhaps that's the first sign that he has changed. He no longer wants to persuade. He wants to tell the truth. There is a profound psychological difference between apologizing to reduce your guilt and apologizing because another person's experience finally matters as much as your own. The first apology seeks relief. The second offers responsibility. Only one of them creates genuine repair. He remembers all the times she apologized first. Sometimes for things that weren't even hers to carry. I'm sorry we argued. I'm sorry you're stressed. I'm sorry I made tonight difficult. Now, he wonders how often those apologies were actually attempts to preserve connection. Not admissions of fault. Many people apologize. Not because they believe they're wrong. Because losing closeness feels more frightening than being misunderstood. The weight of that realization sits heavily inside him. Because perhaps she had been protecting the relationship, while he had been protecting his pride. Days pass. He writes messages in his notes app instead of sending them. Entire paragraphs. He deletes them all. One version explains everything. Too defensive. Another is only 3 words. I'm truly sorry. Too incomplete. Another asks if they can talk. Too demanding. Every draft reveals something about him. Less about her. He begins realizing that writing the message is changing him, even if she never reads it. Healing sometimes begins with conversations that are never delivered. Not because silence is always best, but because honest reflection reorganizes the mind. He finally hears himself saying things he'd avoided for years. Not to her. To himself. I was emotionally absent. I assumed love would wait. I thought understanding happened automatically. Those admissions do not destroy him. Surprisingly, they make him feel lighter. Truth rarely weakens us. Resistance to truth usually does. Then another thought arrives. One he has avoided until now. What if reaching out is not an act of love, but an attempt to escape grief? That question forces him to pause. Motivation matters. Love asks, what would be good for both of us? Loneliness asks, what would make me feel better right now? Those are not always the same thing. He thinks about her healing. If she has finally found peace, what right does he have to disturb it? At the same time, if he never reaches out, will she spend the rest of her life believing he never understood? There are no perfect answers, only competing forms of uncertainty. The movies make this moment look simple. Someone runs through an airport. A dramatic confession. Music swells. Everything changes. Real life is quieter, more complicated. Healing doesn't usually happen through grand gestures. It happens through emotional readiness. Two people may love each other deeply and still meet at different stages of growth. Timing is often an invisible participant in every relationship. One afternoon, he passes the park where they used to walk together. He sits on the same bench. Children run across the grass. An elderly couple shares a sandwich. A young man nervously proposes nearby. Life continues in every direction. He watches strangers creating memories without realizing they're doing so. He wonders if that's what they had once been. Two ordinary people, completely unaware that one day, every ordinary afternoon would become sacred. He closes his eyes, not to escape, to remember accurately. Not only her laughter, her disappointment, not only the vacations, the difficult conversations, not only the way she loved him, the ways he had struggled to receive that love. For the first time, he remembers the relationship as a whole, not edited by nostalgia, not distorted by regret. Complete, human, imperfect, real. He reaches for his phone again. Her name appears. His heartbeat accelerates. His breathing becomes shallow. The body remembers before the mind decides. His thumb rests above the screen. Seconds stretch into minutes. Then, he locks the phone and slips it back into his pocket. Not because pride won. Not because fear won. Because something inside him whispers a quieter question. If she answered today, would I truly be reaching out to love her? Or to relieve myself? He doesn't yet know. And for the first time, instead of rushing to silence the uncertainty, he allows himself to sit with it. Perhaps emotional maturity isn't measured by how quickly we send the message. Perhaps it's measured by whether we've become the kind of person whose words would finally be different. Because the hardest messages are never difficult to write. They're difficult to become. And somewhere between deleting another draft and finally understanding why he wanted to send it, he realized that reaching out wasn't only about crossing the distance between two phones. It was about crossing the distance between the man she had once tried so desperately to reach and the man he was only now beginning to become. There is a moment in grief that doesn't feel like grief at all. It feels like awakening, not because the pain disappears, because understanding finally arrives. For months, he had been asking the wrong question. Why did she leave? Now, another question quietly replaced it. What was she carrying while she stayed? That single question changed everything. Love is often misunderstood. We imagine it as something dramatic. Confessions, anniversaries, flowers, passionate kisses in the rain. But the nervous system doesn't build attachment through dramatic moments. It builds attachment through consistency, safety, reliability. Thousands of ordinary interactions that quietly teach the brain, you are not alone. He had spent years enjoying that safety, without ever asking who was creating it. One Saturday morning, he woke unusually early. The apartment was silent. Sunlight stretched across the kitchen floor. Without thinking, he walked toward the coffee maker. Then he stopped. For years, he never had to wonder whether there was enough coffee left. Somehow, there always had been. He smiled sadly. She had noticed before he did. Not because coffee mattered. Because he mattered. The realization was strangely overwhelming. How many invisible decisions had she made? Simply to make his life feel easier? How many things had happened so smoothly that he had mistaken them for coincidence? Psychologists sometimes speak about something called cognitive load. The invisible effort required to remember, plan, anticipate, organize, and prevent problems before they happen. In healthy relationships, that mental load is often shared. But sometimes, one partner quietly begins carrying more and more of it. Not because anyone asked them to. Because love naturally notices. She noticed. Always. She remembered birthdays. Not only family birthdays. Co-workers. Friends. His mother's doctor's appointment. His father's favorite dessert. His sister's graduation. She remembered names of people he'd mentioned only once. She remembered the restaurant he'd said he wanted to try 6 months earlier. She remembered when he was nervous before presentations. She remembered how quiet he became whenever work overwhelmed him. She remembered. Because loving someone means your brain gradually begins organizing itself around their well-being. He had interpreted her memory as personality. Now, he understood it was devotion. One afternoon, he found an old grocery receipt tucked inside a cookbook. He stared at the list. Pasta, milk, chicken, coffee, blueberries, his favorite cereal, medicine. Nothing extraordinary. Then he noticed something. Almost everything on the receipt reflected his preferences. Very little reflected hers. He tried remembering what she actually liked to eat. The answer came slowly. Too slowly. The thought unsettled him. She had remembered every version of him. Yet somewhere along the way, he had stopped paying equal attention to her. Not intentionally. Gradually. Almost invisibly. Love often disappears inside habit. Not because it becomes smaller. Because it becomes expected. He remembered another evening. She had been packing for a weekend trip. Without asking, she packed extra pain relievers. A phone charger. An umbrella. Snacks. A sweatshirt because she knew he'd complain about being cold later. At the time, he laughed. You always overpack. She smiled. Maybe. Now. He wondered if that had ever really been about luggage. Perhaps. She had simply spent years anticipating discomfort before it reached him. This is one of the quietest forms of love. Preventive care. The kind that receives almost no recognition because, when it succeeds, nothing bad happens. No crisis. No emergency. No dramatic rescue. Just a smoother day. A calmer evening. A forgotten problem that never becomes visible. Invisible success rarely receives appreciation. He thought about all the times she reminded him to eat. To sleep. To call his parents. To bring a jacket. To schedule the appointment he'd been avoiding. Sometimes he teased her. You sound like my mother. She laughed. But looking back, he realized something. She wasn't trying to control him. She was trying to reduce his future stress. Her brain had quietly become invested in protecting his. There is fascinating research suggesting that long-term couples gradually become external memory systems for one another. One remembers passwords. The other remembers birthdays. One tracks finances. The other notices emotional changes. Together, they become something larger than either individual alone. He suddenly realized. She had become part of his executive functioning. Not because he was incapable, because she had lovingly filled spaces before he even noticed they existed. The apartment felt different now. Not emptier. Less organized. Small things accumulated. Laundry. Expired groceries. Missed appointments. Bills paid later than usual. Plans forgotten. It wasn't that he couldn't manage adulthood. He could. But he was suddenly experiencing the amount of invisible attention she had quietly contributed every single week. He remembered complaining once that relationships shouldn't be so much work. The irony almost made him laugh. Because she had been doing enormous amounts of work, simply to make the relationship feel effortless. Then another memory surfaced. One that hurt more than the others. They had attended a family gathering. He spent hours talking with relatives. Laughing. Enjoying himself. Driving home. He remembered saying, "That was fun." She smiled softly. "I'm glad." Only now did he remember what happened before everyone arrived. She had cleaned the apartment. Bought a gift. Wrapped it. Picked up his dry cleaning. Reminded him about the time. Called his mother. Planned the route. Prepared everything. He had experienced the evening. She had produced it. He wasn't ashamed because she had helped. He was ashamed because he had never fully seen the helping. Recognition matters. Human beings can tolerate extraordinary effort when they feel emotionally seen. What drains us is invisible effort. Working hard while feeling unnoticed. Loving deeply while wondering if anyone understands the weight you're carrying. Perhaps that had been part of her exhaustion. Not only the emotional conversations, the constant management of ordinary life. He remembered how often she asked, "Do you need anything?" Such a simple sentence. He searched his memory. How often had he asked her the same question? Not after she'd already started struggling. Before. Love anticipates. Indifference reacts. That distinction suddenly became impossible to ignore. One evening, he watched an elderly couple at a grocery store. The husband reached automatically toward a shelf. His wife gently stopped him. "Not that one. You said your stomach doesn't like that brand anymore." He smiled. "Oh, right." The exchange lasted 3 seconds. Most shoppers never noticed. But he couldn't stop watching. That tiny correction represented decades of observation. Thousands of remembered details. Countless ordinary acts of care. Love had never looked dramatic. It had looked attentive. His mind drifted back to her. How many times had she quietly redirected his life by 5 degrees? Enough to keep him healthier. Calmer. Better rested. More connected to the people he loved. He had mistaken that stability as his normal life. Now, he understood that much of what felt normal had actually been her love. Another uncomfortable truth appeared. She hadn't only carried practical responsibilities. She had carried emotional weather. When he came home frustrated, she adjusted her tone. When he felt discouraged, she offered reassurance. When he withdrew, she patiently waited for him to reopen. When conflict emerged, she often regulated herself first, so the conversation wouldn't become destructive. This is known in psychology as co-regulation. 2 nervous systems continuously influencing one another. He had benefited from hers, without realizing how much energy it required. He remembered countless evenings when she somehow knew, before he spoke, that something was wrong. "You seem quieter today." He used to answer, "I'm fine." She rarely argued. She simply stayed nearby. Sometimes bringing tea. Sometimes sitting beside him in silence. Sometimes changing the subject because she sensed he wasn't ready. That wasn't mind reading. It was years of careful observation. She had learned his emotional language. He had never fully learned hers. The realization wasn't about blame anymore. It was about asymmetry. One person had become deeply fluent in the other's inner world. The other had remained conversational. Not absent. Not uncaring. Simply less attentive. As weeks passed, he noticed something surprising. The more clearly he saw her invisible labor, the less he idealized her. Because she was no longer becoming a fantasy. She was becoming a complete human being. A woman who sometimes felt overwhelmed, who became tired, who occasionally wanted someone else to remember, someone else to anticipate, someone else to ask first. What can I carry for you today? Perhaps that was all she'd ever wanted. Not perfection. Partnership. The word partnership lingered in his thoughts. Love isn't measured only by how much affection we feel. It's measured by how much responsibility we willingly share. Responsibility for practical life. For emotional repair. For remembering. For noticing. For carrying. She had not wanted him to become someone else. She had simply wanted the weight to belong to both of them. Looking back, he understood why the breakup had felt so shocking. He had experienced the loss of one person. She had experienced years of carrying two emotional worlds. Those are very different forms of exhaustion. One night, he stood in the kitchen holding 2 coffee mugs. The old habit returned before conscious thought. One for him. One for her. He stared at the second mug for a long time. Then he slowly placed it back inside the cabinet. Not with the panic he once felt. Not even with despair. With gratitude. Because the empty space beside him was finally teaching him something no relationship ever could while it was still intact. Love had never been measured by how loudly she said, "I love you." It had been measured by everything she quietly carried. So he wouldn't have to. And only after that weight disappeared did he finally understand how incredibly heavy it had always been. That realization would stay with him long after the grief itself began to soften. Because once someone truly sees the invisible architecture of another person's love, they can never again mistake care for coincidence. And perhaps that is the final lesson before the story reaches its end. Not every man who loses a great love gets another chance to hold it again. But every man who truly understands what that love was carrying has already become someone profoundly different from the man who first let it slip quietly through his hands. Every love story eventually reaches a point where there are no more explanations left to collect, no more conversations to replay, no more hidden meanings to uncover. The mind grows quieter, not because it has forgotten, because it has finally understood enough to stop searching. And that is where this story truly ends. Not with a reunion, not with a goodbye, but with a man who is no longer the same person who once believed love would always wait. People often ask what happens after someone leaves. Do they come back? Do they move on? Do they regret it? Do they find someone new? Those questions are understandable, but they miss something much deeper. The most important question isn't whether she returns. It's whether the person she left behind has learned to love differently. Because relationships don't only reveal who we love, they reveal who we are while loving. Some men do reach out. Months later. Sometimes years later. Not because loneliness finally became unbearable. Because they finally became emotionally available enough to tell the truth. The conversation is quieter than they imagined. There are no dramatic speeches. No desperate promises. No attempt to erase the past. Just honesty. I understand now. I didn't before. I wish I had. Sometimes. Those words arrive too late. The other person has already built a peaceful life. Their grief has transformed into wisdom. Their nervous system no longer waits for footsteps at the door. Their mornings belong to someone else. Or perhaps, they simply belong to themselves. Healing has made room where longing once lived. This is one of the hardest realities to accept. Understanding does not reverse time. Growth does not guarantee another chance. Insight is not a currency that can purchase the past. Life doesn't always reward us with the opportunity to apply our lessons to the people who taught them. Sometimes, the lesson itself is all that remains. Other men never send the message. Not because they never cared. Not because pride won forever. Because somewhere along the journey, they realized that reaching out would ask another person to carry something that no longer belongs to them. Their regret, their unfinished healing, their desire for redemption. Instead, they choose a more difficult path. They allow their transformation to become the apology. Not through words, through the way they live. There is a quiet dignity in that. Not every realization must become a conversation. Some become character. Some become patience. Some become gentleness. Some become the reason another person is loved better in the future. Psychologists often describe emotional maturity not as the absence of pain, but as an increased capacity to remain open while experiencing it. Earlier in his life, pain had made him defensive, withdrawn, distracted, emotionally unavailable. Now, pain was making him more curious, more compassionate, more willing to stay present. The same emotion was producing an entirely different man. He noticed the changes in ordinary moments. A friend confided in him. Instead of immediately offering solutions, he listened, really listened. Someone paused before speaking. He waited instead of filling the silence. His mother repeated a story he had heard many times before. This time, he noticed the loneliness underneath it. He called her more often, not because he felt obligated, because he understood something he had once overlooked. Attention is one of the purest forms of love. Months passed, then more. The sharp edges of grief slowly rounded into memory. There were still moments. A familiar song. A particular perfume. A restaurant they used to visit. Certain autumn evenings. Memory never disappeared. It simply stopped demanding. It became a companion, instead of a wound. One afternoon, while walking through a bookstore, he noticed the same novel she had once recommended. Months earlier, he would have walked away. The reminder would have hurt too much. This time, he picked it up, bought it, read it. Halfway through, he smiled. She had been right. He finally understood why she loved it. He laughed quietly to himself. Even now, she was still expanding his world. That realization carried no bitterness, only gratitude. Love does not completely end when relationships do. Sometimes, its influence simply changes direction. It continues through what it taught us, through the habits it left behind, through the ways it permanently altered our perception. Some people never stop loving us through proximity. Others continue loving us through transformation. He began noticing couples differently. Not with envy, with awareness. He saw a woman reaching for her partner's hand before crossing a busy street. He noticed a husband quietly carrying his wife's heavier grocery bag. He watched two elderly people walking more slowly, so neither would be left behind. Years ago, those moments would have disappeared into the background. Now, they caught his attention immediately. Because once you've truly understood love, you begin recognizing its quiet language everywhere. The greatest change, however, happened inside him. He no longer measured relationships by excitement, or chemistry, or how intensely someone made him feel. He began asking different questions. Can we repair after misunderstanding? Can we stay curious when we're hurt? Can we notice one another before resentment grows? Can we protect each other's nervous systems instead of constantly testing them? Can we carry life together, instead of asking one person to carry both? Those questions would have sounded boring to his younger self. Now, They sounded like home. There is an old misconception that heartbreak hardens people. Sometimes it does. When pain becomes bitterness. When disappointment becomes cynicism. When fear becomes avoidance. But heartbreak can also soften us. If we're willing to learn from it, it can teach us to apologize sooner, to assume less, to ask more questions, to notice invisible effort, to say thank you for ordinary things, to hug a little longer, to answer, "How are you?" with something honest. Not because life became easier, because someone once showed us what emotional generosity looked like. Perhaps that was her final gift. Not the relationship itself, the person he became because of it. There is another truth that often goes unnoticed. We tend to believe we remember people exactly as they were. We don't. Over time, memory keeps the lessons more faithfully than the details. Eventually, he struggled to remember the exact sound of her laughter, the precise shade of her favorite sweater, the words of certain conversations. But he never forgot how she made people feel emotionally safe. He never forgot how carefully she listened. He never forgot the consistency of her kindness. The human brain naturally compresses memory. Facts fade. Meaning remains. One evening, years later, someone new sat across from him. They laughed over dinner. The conversation flowed easily. As they prepared to leave, she absent-mindedly reached for her coat. Without thinking, he held it open for her. She smiled. "Thank you." The gesture lasted only a second. It wasn't planned. It wasn't performative. It had simply become part of who he was. In another life, he might never have noticed such moments. Now, they emerged naturally. Love had changed his instincts. Perhaps that is what healing actually looks like. Not forgetting someone, becoming someone. If he ever thought about the woman who left, he no longer imagined changing the ending. He honored it, because painful as it had been, that ending forced him to ask questions he never would have asked otherwise. Questions about responsibility, presence, emotional courage, partnership. Questions that eventually reshaped the architecture of his inner life. Did she know any of this? Maybe. Maybe not. Perhaps she never learned how deeply she had influenced him. Perhaps she assumed he never understood. That possibility saddened him. But it no longer imprisoned him. Because understanding someone after they've gone still changes the person who remains. And perhaps that is the quiet truth hidden inside so many endings. Not every relationship survives. Not every apology arrives on time. Not every love receives another chapter. But no love that is truly felt ever leaves us exactly as it found us. The people who touch us most deeply continue shaping us long after the conversations end. They remain in the patience we offer, the empathy we practice, the attention we finally learn to give, the way we remember birthdays, the way we ask, "How are you?" Really, the way we pause before assuming, the way we choose understanding over being right. Some men return. Some never do. Some are welcomed back. Some are not. Some spend years hoping for another chance. Others quietly accept that the story has already finished. But there is one thing they all share. If they truly loved, and if they truly allowed themselves to learn, none of them leave unchanged. Because love was never only about finding another person. It was also about discovering the parts of ourselves that only another human being could reveal. Sometimes those discoveries happen while we are together. Sometimes they arrive only after the silence, after the absence, after the long nights, after the regret, after the understanding. And perhaps that is the most hopeful truth of all. The greatest purpose of love is not simply to keep two people together forever. Its greatest purpose is to leave us more awake, more compassionate, more emotionally honest than we were before it found us. So if this story feels familiar, if somewhere inside these chapters you recognized your own memories, your own mistakes, your own unanswered messages, remember this. The ending of a relationship is not always the ending of love's work. Sometimes, it is where love begins doing its deepest work, inside the person who remains. And if one day, someone places their heart gently into your hands again, perhaps you will notice the invisible things, the quiet sacrifices, the ordinary routines, the emotional labor that asks for no applause. Perhaps you will ask, what are you carrying? Before they become too tired to answer. Perhaps you will reach, before they stop reaching. And perhaps, that is how one great love, even if it could not be saved, still succeeds in changing the future. Not by rewriting the past, but by teaching a human heart how to love more fully, the next time it is entrusted with another.
Thank you for spending this moment with me. If this message resonated with your soul, remember to subscribe and continue this journey with us here on Twin Flame Journey. And always remember, what is meant for your soul will always find its way back to you. Until next time, beautiful soul, trust the journey.